Was the war worth it? Well, joining me to discuss that is Lindsey German, convener of Stop the War, and Matthew Glanville, a former advisor for Afghan and US security forces. Let's remind ourselves, first of all, before we start the debate, of some of the facts of the war. Well, in Britain's 13-year involvement in Afghanistan, 453 British troops were killed. 576 UK personnel were seriously or very seriously injured. The highest loss of life in a single year came in 2009, when 108 Britons died. Let's bring in Lindsey German first. Matthew Glanville first of all. Matthew, when you hear those facts, a stark reminder of the number of deaths who died in the UK, but also thousands of Afghans have died over the 13 years. Was it worth it?
On balance, just, but the key thing now is that we have to maintain the support for the Afghan military, because if the Afghan military fails in the next 6 to 18 months, then it won't have been worth it. We need to keep our focus in a way that we didn't in Iraq on continuing to support the Afghan military with funding and with training, if not with troops on the ground.
So you say on balance just. I mean, that's quite damning in a way, coming from somebody with your experience in that part of the world. Do you think it's questionable whether we should have even been there at all?
No, we have to remember when we first went in 2001, we didn't have any choice. Where we did have a choice and where there were political failings was in 2005, 2006, when, for political reasons, we took on control of an area and took the fight to the Taliban in an area that initially we simply didn't have enough troops to control.
Okay. Lindsey German, when we look at the situation of life in Afghanistan now, it is better than it was in 2001, isn't it? Life expectancy's gone up. Back in 2001, no women were at school. Now, it's only 36% of girls are at school, but it is at least 36% when there was 0% before. There's a burgeoning democracy there. The fact that life is now better in Afghanistan for some, does that not justify our involvement in the UK?
Well, no, I don't think it does at all. And I think we have to be honest about the situation in Afghanistan. It's one of the worst places in the world for women to live. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. And the truth of the matter is we have spent more than 10 times as much on the military in that country as we have on building infrastructure and helping civilian life. And perhaps if we'd spent more on that, we would have had a better result. And the truth is the Taliban were easy.
Sorry, but it is not good for women. There's no two ways about it, but it's better than it was.
Well, but the country is still, the warlords are still, who are as bad to women as the Taliban ever were, are still in control of large parts of the country. They're part of the government. The government is extremely corrupt, and the truth is that the Taliban are coming back. The point that Matthew made, that actually, if you look at the situation, this is not a situation where the Western troops have won, or in any sense have won. And indeed, 10,000 US troops are staying there, and hundreds of British troops are staying there. 4,000 Afghan troops have died in this year alone. There is a war going on there. And this is something which has gone on longer than the First World War and longer than the Second World War put together.
You mentioned the number of Afghans who've died there. Of course, as we said earlier, 453 British lives lost. Each one left a family behind. Let's hear from the mother of the youngest British soldier to die in Afghanistan. William Aldridge was killed in 2009, shortly after his 18th birthday. His mother, Lucy, told us about the effect his death had on her.
I've had some extremely dark times throughout that 5-year period. Contemplated suicide myself. Attempted suicide. I had a struggle with being a mum and needing to be here for William's younger siblings and wanting to be with him, with my firstborn. I'm glad that British troops are actually pulling out of the country. I would have actually liked to have seen it happen a lot earlier. I would have liked the number of casualties to have been reduced by our withdrawal. I think that from the outset the conflict was ill-conceived, ill-planned, and I think that's something that definitely needs to be looked at post-withdrawal. I think the biggest fear for all families is that Afghanistan will become much like Iraq did, that we haven't truly achieved whatever we set out to do, that Afghanistan will revert to the lawless country that it was prior to our involvement in the Middle East.
Let's bring in Matthew Glanville. And you hear that mother's tale, the brutal loss of a son. Was his death worth it, do you think?
Absolutely heartrending to hear, and it's the military needs to put more effort into supporting families while their sons are on operations. But to the point about what will happen in Afghanistan, as a country, we won't go back to the state of civil war that existed in the 90s. Kabul in the north is secure in a way that it wasn't. The south has had a sort of parallel Taliban-run government for the last 2 or 3 years, and that will probably continue.
Lindsey German, when we look at what the Taliban were doing back in 2001, do you really think it was an option for us not to get involved? Could we just have stood by and allowed them to continue ruling the country with terror the way they were? Admittedly, they haven't been fully broken, but they are a lot more weak than they were in 2001 now.
Well, I've got no time for the Taliban, and I've never supported them. They've been removed from government, as you say, which they had in 2001, and I don't suppose many people regret that. But they do control parts of the country now, and we should remember what this whole war was supposed to be about. It wasn't mainly about getting rid of the Taliban. It was about destroying al-Qaeda, capturing Osama bin Laden, which they eventually executed bin Laden. But the idea that terrorism has been dealt with by this war, we know that terrorism has spread massively, not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where there is also a war going on, but also throughout the Middle East. And part of the reason that groups like ISIS have come to have such a strength in parts of the Middle East is to do with grievances about the war in Afghanistan. And we shouldn't have any illusions about this. The war on terror has been a complete failure in its own terms.
That's an interesting point, isn't it, Lindsey? Matthew, before we come to you to respond on that, let's just remind ourselves of some of the things that have been achieved in Afghanistan. Nearly 6 million Afghan children now go to school, up from 1 million in 2001. 40% of them, as I was saying a little earlier, 36, would have been unthinkable under the Taliban. More than half the population now has access to primary healthcare. That's up from 9% in 2003. And Afghanistan's economy has also improved. Its GDP of almost £12.9 billion is 8 times higher than it was in 2001. Matthew Glanville, these are the statistics that the government, the Ministry of Defence, wants us to talk about. These are the improvements in Afghanistan. But as Lindsey points out there, these weren't the reasons we went into Afghanistan in the first place, was it? It was to stop the spread of Islamist terror groups. How have we done on that?
Relatively well within Afghanistan itself, in the sense that there haven't been transnational attacks as there were most notably on September the 11th. But the point about the stabilisation and the building up of the Afghan state and economy is that as more and more people are engaged in a Kabul-based government, they're far less likely to allow transnational jihadists in. What's needed is a developing economy and a developing state, and Afghanistan is nowhere near Western levels in either of those two areas, but it is still better than it was, and it's still better than it would have been if we hadn't intervened.
Are we any safer back here in the UK than we would have been?
I think in a very narrow sense of plots emerging from Afghanistan, yes, I think we are. But your other contributors' point about ISIS and the other states is that there are individual issues in each of these regions that contribute to terrorism. Actually, the idea that the success or failure of something in Afghanistan impacts ISIS is incorrect.
Lindsey, do you feel that? Do you feel that here in the UK we are possibly a little safer because of what we've done over the last 13 years, or the opposite?
I think the opposite. I think that actually, if you look at the Taliban, whatever you think of the Taliban, it, as Matthew says, it didn't have ambitions really outside of Afghanistan and Pakistan. What's happened is, and it's not a question of whether ISIS came from Afghanistan, of course they didn't, but if you look at the grievances which have helped to fuel terrorism, the Afghan war is a very major part of it, and we're still having a situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan where people are being killed by drone attacks, where civilians are being killed, wedding parties, all this sorts of thing. This feeds the terrorism in other parts of the world, and therefore I think actually Britain is a considerably more dangerous place than 13 years ago, a view which is shared by people like Eliza Manningham Buller, who was the head of MI5. I think we're in quite a dangerous situation now, and there has to be a change in foreign policy. There has to be a political change rather than simply talking about marginal improvements, which quite frankly, some of which are extremely selective if you look at the situation in Afghanistan.
Matthew Glanville?
The point is, you can't disengage from the world. If we adopted a foreign policy because we thought it would upset people and that they might send disillusioned young people to try and blow themselves up here, we wouldn't do anything. I mean, I agree in the sense that we need a realistic foreign policy, of which defending ourselves from jihadists is one element, but there's also a moral obligation. Whatever the rights and wrongs of taking out the Taliban, and indeed the same applies to Saddam Hussein, once you remove what was a barbaric but still broadly functioning state, you have an obligation to put in place the mechanisms for that state to develop. You can't remove a government and then just fail to acknowledge any responsibility for it.
Yeah, Lindsey, you want to come back in there?
That moral obligation has not been met either in Iraq or Afghanistan. Iraq is a country which is now falling apart, and Afghanistan, in my view, will be a country which effectively is partitioned. And I know that many people who don't agree with my view on the war also agree that this is a likely outcome. The truth of the matter is, when bin Laden attacked the Twin Towers in 2001, he gave as the grievances put forward then were American troops on Saudi soil. There were American troops in many parts of the Middle East. Now, the grievances of the Palestinians and the sanctions on Iraq. All of these situations have got worse over the last 13 years.
Matthew, as we leave Afghanistan and we look towards the future, do you think we've left it in the best position we could? Do you think we should have stayed for longer? Do you think we should have put more money into it, possibly lost more lives, and waited until the country was a bit more stable?
No, I think what was needed was a much clearer political strategy at the beginning in terms of exactly what we were trying to achieve. At one point it was opium, at one point it was women's education, at one point it was the Taliban, at other points, as the other contributor said, it was about taking on al-Qaeda. What we need to do is not so much troops or indeed great amounts of money, it's just focus attention. Our governmental class moves on too quickly from these kind of disasters, and that's why what's happened in Iraq has happened, because we all just ignored the situation for 3 or 4 years post-2010.
Okay, then we must leave it. Matthew Glanville, Lindsey German, thank you both very much.